Hello, my name is John Smithin, and I'm the Executive Co-Director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute here in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. With me today is Ronen Grunberg, who's the Vice President Technology of the Aurora Philosophy Institute, and as I keep reminding people, was the original founder of the old Tuesday Philosophy Club here in Aurora long ago. Perhaps to anticipate some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, in the beginning was Ronen Grunberg.
You make me sound very old, John.
I'm not as old as me. Well, Ronen, we've done quite a few of these videos now, and I'm kind of hoping that I can control some of the nervous mannerisms, see, I just did it, that I always exhibit. You know, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, it gives me great pleasure, etc. Anyway, I won't go on. Last time, we talked about a realist turn in philosophy, which is very recent, 21st century. And we quoted a book from 2020, which is just 3 years ago. And the authors were advocating an approach called Metaphysical Realism. But Ronen, you have suggested looking first at a somewhat older philosophical movement from the 20th century, Critical Realism. Why do you think we should do this?
Well, my reasoning was really actually quite simple. Metaphysical realism is pretty straightforward because it's a single layered ontology. But critical realism is a little more difficult. It's a little more stratified in that it suggests that there are layers of being, and that those layers of being interact with one another. So when I say layers of being, I'm saying that the mind constitutes a certain type of being, empirical reality constitutes a certain type of being, and the interaction between them is critical for human knowledge. And what the critical realists try to do is emphasize the importance of understanding the causal powers and mechanisms that are within those different ontological realities. And I think it's really important to lay down this more complex idea on the table, because I think it'll make discussing metaphysical realism easier for the audience.
Okay, good. So nothing to do with the timing of American Thanksgiving then?
Nothing to do with American Thanksgiving whatsoever.
Okay, fine. Fair enough. I'll take your word for that. Anyway, I first learned about critical realism 30 years ago at Cambridge University, and it was championed by Professor Tony Lawson, drawing on the earlier work of the philosopher Roy Bhaskar. And it argues for an ontological turn in methodology, that is, towards a realist social ontology. The argument is that there should be less reliance on statistical induction that seeks evidence of constant event conjunctions, that kind of thing. And I think that from the philosophical point of view, the most significant aspect of critical realism is the qualifier critical, because this indicates acceptance of all or most of the implications of the critique of knowledge, which was the product of the high modern period in philosophy from Descartes in the 17th century down to Kant in the 18th. Obviously, modern in philosophy doesn't mean up to date or anything like that, quite the contrary. Anyhow, the vocabulary and presuppositions of critical realism tend to be Kantian in nature. So Kant's magnum opus, of course, was the Critique of Pure Reason, which is where the term critical comes from. So Ronen, what do you understand by this idea of the critique of knowledge?
Well, okay, John, it's a very hard thing to summarize Kant in a couple of words, but I'm going to try to do that here just to give a sense of what the critique of knowledge is all about.
Yeah, that's why you get paid the big bucks.
Right. Well, right.
Well, the small bucks.
This is very small bucks, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So Kant basically distinguishes between analytic and synthetic judgment. Analytic judgments are not judgments that give us any new information about the world, and synthetic judgments are judgments that give us information about the world. We're not going to get into the details of what that means, but essentially what Kant is trying to do is formulate the existence of synthetic a priori knowledge. So that is knowledge that is related to experience, but known independently of experience, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So let me flesh that out just a little bit. What Kant brings to the table, and what is really interesting about Kant, is that he argues that knowledge is shaped by the structure of the mind. We can only know phenomena, which are appearances, but we can't know things in themselves. So the world outside of us represents what he calls the noumena. And we can't know the noumena in and of itself. The only way we can know reality is through the categories of understanding. And the categories of understanding are innate. They are in us. They are universal. Kant identifies a number of categories of understanding. The three biggie are causation, space, and time. And the way in which our mind interacts with experience, with reality, is what gives us knowledge. Now, what's really important in this is that Kant is not hierarchical. What he's actually doing is bringing together the age-old sort of conflict between the rationalists, who argue that mind comes first and is more important than experience, and the empiricists, who argue that experience is more important than mind. Kant says, no, they're both equal. The noumena is filtered through the categories of experience, is what gives us knowledge, and the categories of perception are impossible without experience, without a world existing outside of us. So the important thing there is that knowledge is possible for Kant, but not absolute knowledge of experience. It's always mediated through the categories of understanding. And also, reason has its limits, which is why it's the critique of pure reason. Mm-hmm. And what he means by that is that you can't apply the categories of experience or understanding to things outside of experience. You can't, for example, just have pure speculation and think that you know anything, right? You can only know what is out there in the world, because the categories of understanding can only apply to things out there in the world. In any event, this is the essence of Kant. I don't know if I explained it clearly, but Kant essentially is arguing that experience and mind are equal and that are interdependent. They work together in a dynamic.
Yeah. No, it was very clear.
Okay,
it wasn't exactly like Ayn Rand standing on one foot, but it was good.
It's hard to summarize it in two sentences. I apologize.
Yeah. No, my former student, Nancy Mendoza, coined the phrase realism per totam viam, realism all the way, right? Per totam viam is Latin, in the subtitle, actually, of a 2012 PhD thesis. And this work also, like the critical realists, canvassed a realist social ontology, but a realism which goes all the way. And I think what he meant by that, which going all the way, is a realism which does not necessarily accept, as you've just indicated, the implicitly idealist starting point of the critique of knowledge. And it's interesting you raise issues of the philosophy of mind, because it seems to me that the main issues that separate that realism per totam viam and the metaphysical realism, whatever you care to call it, are precisely those of the philosophy of mind. And the point is, it's coming exactly back to what you were saying, what is it that we are conscious of when we are indeed conscious? And I think that the argument is that these old-fashioned moderns in philosophy, starting with Locke, what was Locke, 16th century, 17th century?
Yeah, around there.
Around that, yeah.
I'm bad with dates, but yes.
Some time ago. Anyway, starting with Locke, the moderns tended to suppose that what we are directly conscious of, and all that we are directly conscious of, is the contents of our own minds. And also, this is a comment one often hears, that they tended to use the term idea in a blanket sense. to cover all of the contents of the mind and did not always adequately, therefore, distinguish between the intellect and the senses. Whereas presumably the scholastics previously had focused greatly on intellect, back to your reason kind of thing. And the opposite view to that is that in the case of ideas properly so called, it is the idea's object of which we are directly conscious, not the idea itself. So it's the it's not the contents of our mind; it's the objective itself of which the object itself of which we're directly conscious. And I like a quote by Mortimer J. Adler, which I think kind of sums it up. He would say that the ideas are not that which we apprehend, but the means by which we apprehend the object. And so do you think that's a fair representation of modern thought? I mean, wasn't there an explicit statement to that effect in Locke that, ideas was going to just mean everything that's in the mind?
Yeah, I do think Locke did sort of use the word idea in a very broad way to suggest that it's anything that is perceived by the mind. So it's not like a formulation in logic or anything like that. I do agree with that. So the moderns, like you say, essentially saw consciousness as an internal realm of ideas. And Locke, I agree, did consider the mind directly apprehending its own contents, right? So there's no direct apprehension of what is out there. Yeah. And that's a key idea.
Very, very key.
Yeah, that's a key idea. So
it starts with the moderns,
right? And that is a part of sort of modern philosophical sort of trajectory, I would say. But what is very interesting about Locke is that he was an empiricist, right? So he basically argued that knowledge comes from experience. Locke is the one who said that the mind is essentially a blank slate, tabula rasa, right?
We're very good at Latin.
Yeah, that's right. It's the only Latin I know. Yeah. But he basically then goes on to say, well, there are two types of experiences. There's sensation that comes from outside. It's basically reception of external stimuli through the senses. And then there's reflection, which is the mind's awareness of its own operation. But what is interesting there is that we do not have, when we are talking about sensation, we do not have a direct apprehension of what is out there. We only have apprehension through the mind. Now, that some would say is a problem because it kind of leads to a bit of skepticism about what is really out there. We only have apprehension of our own mind. So can we actually know what is actually out there? I'm not sure it matters. I don't think it would matter to Locke. He argues we have a direct apprehension of what's in our mind, and that's good enough. And he would also say possibly, why would we be deceived? Like, is the problem that you don't know exactly what's out there? You only know what's in your mind? Well, he probably believed that what we have in our mind is probably what is actually out there, because God would not deceive us. What would
that
why
was an
would God
argument
deceive us?
that was argument was kind of commonplace. I don't know whether Locke made it, but around about that time,
Yeah, it's maybe an argument that doesn't hold a lot of water in contemporary sort of intellectual discourse, but it's an argument that is not completely unreasonable. Why would our sensations and our ideas of sensations be deceptive? It doesn't make sense. Even in terms of modern evolutionary theory, it doesn't make sense, because we would be stumbling all over ourselves, and we potentially could get hurt very badly if our ideas of what is out there actually are deceptive.
In my case, I stumble over myself all the time. So that's perhaps
good point.
Yes,
good point.
Never mind. But I do think it's interesting that you should bring up, religion kind of thing, at least implicitly there, because actually there's an underlying premise to our conversation today, which is that these secular debates about critical realism of the late 20th and early 21st century, I mentioned in Cambridge University, for example, were actually anticipated by Catholic scholars in the mid-20th, Catholic scholars, in religion, in the mid-20th century. including Etienne Gilson,
Right.
as a Frenchman, and Bernard Lonergan. I'm going to call him Bernard and not Bernard because I gather he was of Irish descent.
Okay.
So I'll stick with Bernard.
Fair enough.
I don't know what he called himself. Anyway, all of the relevant philosophical issues, this is the point, around the difference between metaphysical realism and critical realism were actually discussed sort of 50 years before the 90s in the debate about 20th century Neo Scholasticism. That is the 20th century revival of the ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas. And our API associate, Sherman Balog, has given a very interesting presentation specifically on Lonergan's critical realist approach, which is available on our API YouTube channel. That actually has the most views ever of any API presentation, 5.9K.
Amazing.
Which is impressive to me. However, I'm 100% sure that we're going to beat that this time. Okay, so let's
pray.
That's our goal. And then we would win the Hemlock Cup or something.
Yeah,
that we used
the YouTube award.
yeah. Okay, right. So now a significant interest of the API is in Canadian philosophy. This is another little thread that we're drawing together here. We have a particular interest in the intellectual scene in Toronto in the 1950s and 1960s, exemplified by such figures as the famous Marshall McLuhan. Ronen, by the way, I think you've given a couple of API talks on McLuhan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love McLuhan. I mean, after all, we are making media of sorts right now. So McLuhan, might be happy about that. And by the way, I think McLuhan would be very impressed that two people like us, can just sit in front of a camera and create media and have, a couple of hundred people, or maybe even 10 people, or no people. Yeah. We'll see. Two people.
Two ancient Luddites like yourselves.
That's right. Speak for yourself. I don't know if I'm an ancient Luddite.
Well, I'm an ancient Luddite, right?
Okay.
And so I have to ask, McLuhan said cool media and hot media. Are we cool or are we hot?
I think of myself as cool.
Yeah. Okay.
But what do you think of yourself as hot?
I think I'm cool, but I also think we're both hot. Okay. So thank you, Marshall.
Fair enough.
Anyhow, Gilson and Lonergan were both part of that Toronto intellectual scene. This is the important point from our point of view. Etienne Gilson, originally from France, was a founder and later director of the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies at St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. And he continued.
I like that word.
Yeah, it's a good one. He continued to be affiliated with the college until 1968. And you see, McLuhan, of course, was also on the faculty of St. Michael's. So, St. Michael's had really world-class scholars in those days. Bernard Lonergan was from Buckingham, Quebec, and eventually was professor at Regis College, which is another Catholic constituent college of the University of Toronto. And he served in 2 terms from 1947, 1953, and from 1965 to 1975. Now, the Magna Opera, you see Latin comes in again, the Magna Opera is the plural of magnum opus.
Right.
So we're heavy in the Latin today. Of the 2 scholars were written, I should say, in Toronto. And Gilson's famous book was Being and Some Philosophers in 1952, and Lonergan's book was Insight, a study of human understanding, which was in 1957. Now, the next set of notes I have, I put in a little note here saying, reminder to myself, get your retaliation in first. Mm-hmm. This is a notorious slogan from professional football, right? Well, how is this relevant to the philosophy of Gilson and Lonergan? Well, the point is that there was actually no direct debate between Gilson and Lonergan. Gilson wrote before Lonergan, and this is important, also claimed that in principle, all versions of critical realism are untenable, regardless of any future novel form they may take. He got his retaliation in first. So this is going to apply to everyone, Lonergan, the secular critical realists, and so forth. There is an explicitly commentary by Lonergan on both Kant and Gilson in a paper, Metaphysics as Horizon, which was published in 1967. But this is quite brief and does not seem decisive. So I say in our talk there, I think the best course is to just separately evaluate the arguments of both authors on their merits.
Mhm.
Now, Gilson does not seem to have ever mentioned Lonergan at all. Presumably, he felt that he did not need to, having already debunked critical realism, at least to his satisfaction. Do you think that sort of attitude is reasonable, Ronen?
I'm not sure that it is reasonable because I think that there's a lot to critical realism that needs to be fleshed out. So just to say, well, I don't need to talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
It seems a little bit much, but I'll go along with it just for your sake. Yes.
Yeah. Well, for Gilson's sake.
Okay, for Gilson's sake, but I'm not sure I would agree with it off the top.
Yeah. So I think what we should do then is just kind of say what each of them said, regardless of whether they said it to each other, kind of thing, right? Okay, Ronen. So we're going to pause the video here. The complete video, by the way, is up on the YouTube channel. And in the next live session on December the 7th, we will continue this discussion, which we just started, about Gilson and Lonergan, and a few other things also, and maybe even some surprises. Anyhow, would you like to just summarize the discussion we have had so far, just for the purposes of the audience and their discussion?
Yeah, I'm going to do my best, John, to summarize. But basically, we're trying to make a distinction between two different approaches. The metaphysical realist approach and the critical realist approach. So metaphysical realism asks basically, what is it that we are conscious of when we are conscious? What is it that we can know when we are conscious? And it is related basically to the philosophy of mind. Critical realists, on the other hand, argue that knowledge is mediated through the mind. So the mind plays a fundamental role in what we know. So, for example, Locke, who is an empiricist, argues that we don't have a direct experience of things out there. What we have is a direct experience of our ideas. He says we have two things, sensation and reflection. And when we have sensation, what we are basically sensing are qualities of the external objects in experience. Perception is not a direct mirror of external reality. Ideas serve as a mental representation. And Kant basically says something similar in that he says we have what he calls the categories of understanding, and our knowledge is shaped by the structures of the mind. So the big question is the difference between metaphysical realism and critical realism important? Does it really make a difference, an epistemological difference in how we know?
Well, thank you, Ron. I wish you told me that before.
There you go.
Okay, thanks.